I'm Jens Heinmüller, one of the co-directors of the Immigration Policy Lab here at Stanford University. And at IPL, we essentially a team of social scientists that is working to bring innovation and evidence to immigration systems worldwide. We partner with a variety of nonprofits and governments at the local and federal level to improve the integration of immigrants and refugees. And as part of this work, we are creating new tools that allow people to better understand the policy landscape around immigration. And that's what brings us here today. First, you'll hear from Steve Sanderson, who is the executive director of the Center for Social Media and Politics at New York University, which helped us build the Tweet Tracker tool. And he'll describe how social media data can give us important insights into contemporary political debates. And then next up will be Alex Siegel, who will give you a closer look at how the Tweet Tracker was built, how it works, and some of the insights that it can deliver. Alex is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and she began working on this project when she was a postdoc at the Immigration Policy Lab at Stanford. And then finally, we'll kick off our discussion with some words from Julia Angwin, who is the editor-in-chief and founder of The Markup. The Markup is a nonprofit newsroom that produces meaningful data-centered journalism about technology and the people affected by it. And before founding The Markup, Julia led investigative teams at the ProPublica and the Wall Street Journal, and she's a winner and two-time finalist of the Pulitzer Prize in Journalism. So we're very excited to have her here today for this event. We'll have a good amount of time at the end of the hour to basically take questions from all of you. And so please, if you have a question, enter them into the Q&A button in the Zoom. And with that, I'll turn it over to Steve. The floor is all yours.
Great, thanks so much. So as Jens said, I'm the executive director of the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics, and we host the data for the Congressional Tweet Tracker. And so before I turn things over to Alex to really dig into the tracker itself, I'm going to sort of briefly explain our involvement in the project and why we're so excited about it. And in doing so, I'm going to try to help sort of situate the tool within the broader study of the sort of evolving relationship between social media and politics. So as a little bit of context for folks who might not be familiar with our work, we are sort of a computational social science research institute here at NYU, and we sort of have three primary aims: to advance scientific knowledge about politics in the digital age, to inform public policy and public discourse, and then of course, to train the next generation of scholars. And our work is really motivated by the sort of various ways that social media has transformed politics writ large, and nowhere is this more true than in strategic political communications. And so when we think about the use of social media in political communications, especially sort of elite communications, such as members of United States Congress, it enables them to do certain things in very specific ways, such as advertise policy positions, interact with constituents, set political agendas, communicate with the media, and sort of provide general information about their activities. And importantly, it does so in a way that enables us to observe the behavior in ways that we may not have before. And so, sort of our work here at CSMAP is motivated not only by trying to understand the way that social media has impacted politics, but also to leverage these new data, to leverage social media data to study politics in ways that may have not been possible before. And so, this is where I think I want to take sort of a step back and talk about both the promises and challenges of utilizing social media data to understand sort of political communications. So first, there's some very sort of straightforward promises. It's accessible, right? API endpoints like the one that we use here for Twitter enables automated data collection at scale of tweets, whereas it might be much tougher for us to try to scrape, let's say, press briefings or press releases from each individual congressional office. It's also temporally granular. Right, so like we could go and try to survey congressional offices about their policy positions, but we would never be able to do so with the sort of regular temporal granularity that's provided by sort of social media data. And finally, it's dynamic. It allows both retrospective and prospective data in sort of in a common format that enables us to understand changes in political positions over time. But there are also a number of challenges, and that's, I think, why we're sort of so excited to be here and to have partnered with Alex and IPL on this tool. So first is that it's, social media data are massive and easy to search. So it's easy to find evidence to support a certain claim, but it's very difficult to sort of contextualize it within the full scope of the data. The second is that, it's difficult to collect, and then it's difficult to analyze. And that's where sort of, I think, our partnership with IPL has been particularly sort of impactful. And so I'm going to sort of speak very briefly about the sort of collection that we do. And then I'm going to turn things over to Alex, and she's going to talk about sort of the tool itself. But what you're going to see today is sort of the top of the funnel. So at the very bottom is actually the streaming sort of Twitter API, where we're able to collect and structure these tweets so that they can be analyzed and then finally visualized in a way that sort of allows us to track political trends on Twitter. And so our work here is the result of our fabulous data engineers, so Megan Brown, Edwin Kamau, and recently Jason Greenfeld, who collect and store sort of massive Twitter data. Alex sort of used cutting edge methods that she applied to it in order to then sort of make sense of it. And then finally, the tracker, which you all will have access to, it now allows you to sort of map and visualize it. And I just want to quickly say before I pass things over to Alex, that what we see this tracker as cutting across all the work that we do here at CSMAP. Our goals are to sort of push forward academic research, to make open source tools available, to leverage research to work with government, media, and civil society, and finally to build the field of folks who are able to sort of study the relationship between social media and politics. And we just think that this tracker is a really exciting way to do so. And so with that, I will pass things over to Alex.
Great, thank you so much, Zeev. I'll go ahead and share my screen here to get us started. So first of all, thank you to Jens for the great introductions. It's a pleasure to be here. This tool was a long time in the making, and so it's great to finally be able to share it publicly with you all. And I want to start by giving a little bit of background motivation for the creation of the tool that I think really taps into some of the dynamics Zeev was just discussing in terms of the work that CSMAP does and the kind of broader impact that social media data can have for both our understanding of political communications and how elites express their agendas publicly in the digital age. So as Zeev mentioned, Twitter data can be used to track online political communication. In terms of thinking about the discourse of members of Congress, as of 2018, every member of Congress had an active Twitter account. And these accounts are used to sort of accomplish a variety of objectives. Politicians are able to broadcast their policy positions on particular issues. They can interact with other elected officials. They can communicate directly in this back and forth way with their constituents. And they can also try to garner media coverage and shape debates around particular policy issues. And so in using online tools to achieve their strategic goals, members of Congress and other political actors are leaving behind these digital traces of their behavior. And by harnessing that data, we can gain really systematic insights into the publicly expressed agendas of these elected officials, which provide this kind of bird's eye view into how debates on important policy issues are shifting in real time. So the goal of this project is to use Twitter data by members of Congress to track their policy positions on immigration. And we begin with a tool focused on immigration because this is helping meet some of the objectives of the Immigration Policy Lab. But as we can talk about later in Q&A, this tool could be expanded and used to cover lots of issue areas and debates that policymakers, journalists, and everyday citizens might be interested in understanding. So to give you an example of the kinds of issue positions that are expressed on Twitter, we start on the left with a tweet from Ted Cruz from September of 2021, which states, "Joe Biden has let in tens of thousands of illegal aliens without court dates, and only about 1 in 10 have checked in with ICE. Now it's reported Biden has lost contact with thousands of illegal alien kids. Biden's open borders agenda is a disaster." Then by contrast, on the right, we have a tweet from Representative Jayapal from 2018 surrounding the family separation crisis, which says, no, we do not need to take away children. We do not need to separate families and cage kids. We do not need to inflict maximum harm on immigrants, as this xenophobic president, here referring to Trump, not Biden, has always done. What we need to do is end this cruelty once and for all. And so what these tweets are designed to provide an example of is the way in which elected officials are constantly responding to events on the ground and expressing policy positions and agendas on immigration. And what we want to do with our Congressional Tweet Tracker tool is harness all of this data to try to get insights into both short-term and long-term trends around these debates. So in terms of how the Congressional Tweet Tracker is constructed, there's a couple of different sources of data and kind of stages in this process. So the first stage of constructing the tool involved collecting historical Twitter data going back to 2013. We wanted to be able to map the immigration debate over as long of a time horizon as possible. And we began with 2013 data because this is the period in which most members of Congress are actually on Twitter. Then the first stage is to identify tweets that are relevant to immigration. And we did this using a word embeddings approach, which I'm happy to discuss in more detail during Q&A. But in addition to just being able to track how often do members of Congress discuss immigration, we want to understand what types of policy positions do they express. So here we first turn to crowdsourced human coding of our data, where we give coders detailed instructions about what types of tweets we might categorize as expressing pro-immigration positions and what types of tweets express anti-immigration positions. We're then able to use this sample of human-coded data to train a supervised machine learning classifier so we can scale up these categorizations and have a full data set of tweets that are classified both in terms of whether or not they're relevant to immigration and then what policy position they express. Now, this first stage of the project is entirely done with historical data, in this case, Twitter data from 2013 to 2020. To update the data in real time is where we turn to CSMAP's collection, which is constantly bringing in real time all tweets produced by members of Congress. And using this classifier that we trained on years of historical data, we're able to feed in the real-time data and automatically categorize it according to whether or not a tweet references immigration and then what policy position it expresses. So this leaves us with this constantly updating real-time measure, which we then display on our publicly available tweet tracker tool. So what's new about our approach? I think the main advantage of the tool we've created is the nearly real-time data. It's updated every week to give us a chance to make sure there's no technological glitches, but this does provide us with much more real-time insight into how the immigration debate is unfolding than other available tools and data sources. We also think a key innovation here is that we're not just focused on topic salience, how often are legislators talking about immigration, but actually categorizing the policy positions that they express. And most of the academic research in this space, as well as work that we've seen from data journalists, typically is focusing on topic salience rather than taking this extra step of categorizing policy positions at scale. Our tool, as I'll begin to show you, also offers a user-friendly interface and is interactive so that users of the tool can filter our data by different time periods, by states, by parties, by Chamber of Congress, and more features. So what does this look like in practice? This image here shows you the kind of first image of the tracker tool that you'll see when you visit the website and when we move into the live demonstration, I'll show you a bit more how to interact with the tool. But first, we have a map which shows the relative salience of immigration across all 50 states. And this view of the site is incorporating all of the data from 2013 to present, but we can look along any time horizon of interest to see how salience shifts. We also have an interactive timeline below, which we can use to drag these sliders in order to filter our data to particular time periods of interest. The second main feature of the tracker site allows you to change the view from looking at all tweets about immigration to looking at this pro versus anti-immigration view, where we can see on average in which states do legislators express more pro-immigration sentiments, and pro-immigration sentiment is in green, or anti-immigration sentiment, which here we show in purple. We can also then look along the timeline to see of the tweets that are about immigration, what percentage of those express pro-immigration positions and what express anti-immigration positions. And again, using the fact that this is interactive, we can slide along the timeline to restrict our data to various time periods of interest, which I'll show you in the live demo. We wanted to understand beyond just sort of typical validation of our machine learning models, to what degree are these categorizations of policy positions capturing real world behavior or capturing meaningful differences in how legislators express themselves. So one of the things we look at is we compare the degree to which legislators tweets express pro-immigration or anti-immigration positions, that's what we call the tweet score here, to their voting behavior. And we use data from the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda, which collects congressional voting behavior data on immigration issues. And we can see just at first glance that the Twitter behavior of these legislators is highly correlated with their voting behavior in Congress, which provides some kind of initial gut check that we're picking up on meaningful differences here. Another thing that we can do to try to understand what exactly are pro and anti-immigration tweets is to use structural topic models, which are an unsupervised machine learning method that allow us to see which topics show up more in pro-immigration tweets as opposed to anti-immigration tweets. And here we see some of the common topics that show up in pro-immigration tweets include tweets welcoming immigrants or refugees, talking about family separation or the need to reunite families, Spanish language tweets, and tweets about the travel ban, all topics which we might typically categorize as expressing pro-immigration policy positions. Then on the anti-immigration side, we see some topics such as those focused on border security, the government shutdown, which occurred in large part over the degree to which Trump's border wall should be funded, and discussions of the southern border more generally. So when we dig into the specific topics that show up in each of these categories, they tend to split along the lines that we might expect. So what can our tool show us in practice? I first just want to introduce some of the features of the site, and then I'll move over into a live demonstration. So first, we think this tool is particularly useful for examining both short and long-term trends in the salience and sentiment expressed by legislators about immigration, because we have this timeline feature that allows us to slice and dice our data and zoom in on periods of interest. We can understand how shifts occur over long periods and also monitor short-term changes, including relatively recent ones as our data continues to update in real time. Another thing that we can look at using our tracker is regional trends. We have several categories of states that are pre-populated on the site that allow users of the tool to automatically restrict their analysis to particular states of interest. This example shown here restricts the salience data just to southern border states, but there are several other categories that I'll show during the live demonstration. We can also look at individual state by state trends for any given moment in time, we can easily see what proportion of the tweets about immigration coming from legislators in each state express more pro-immigration positions in green or anti-immigration positions in purple. And another feature of the site is that the data can also be divided by party and chamber. So we can see what percentage of pro-immigration tweets are coming from Democrats or Republicans, what percentages are coming from representatives in the House as opposed to senators. And we can also restrict the data to zoom in on different combinations of these actors. For example, we might be interested in how Democrats in the Senate are discussing immigration in a particular period of time, and our tool makes it easy for users to automatically restrict the data both to time periods of interest, but also these groups of interest. A final feature of the site, which I'll show in the live demo, is this key moments feature, where we've identified several moments in time around which we think people might be interested in tracking the immigration debate. And by clicking on any of these key moments, users of the site can first learn more about the event and then restrict the data to the couple of months before and after the event in order to easily pick up on those shorter term trends. So with that, after kind of introducing the site generally, I want to actually bring it up here on the screen and get us all started looking at it. So let me just stop sharing my screen for a moment, and I will go ahead and reshare here. Okay, so here is a zoomed in version of the Tweet Tracker website. I've zoomed in to make it easier to read what's on here while sharing my screen. But when you visit the site yourself, you'll get a slightly zoomed out version of this. And so the first thing you see on the site is this interactive map of the US, which shows salience of immigration by state, where darker states are states in which legislators talk more about immigration, and lighter states are states in which legislators talk relatively less about immigration. So to show you in practice what kind of information we can gather here, if we mouse over Texas, which is a dark color state indicating relatively high level of salience of immigration, we can see that in Texas, 5.2% of legislators' tweets are about immigration, which makes it a relatively high salience state in our data set. And we can also understand where this number came from. So the 5.2% comes from the fact that legislators in Texas across this time period produced about 8,000 tweets about immigration, and that's out of a total of 156,000 tweets. So for each state you mouse over, you can get a sense of both the proportion of tweets about immigration, but also where these numbers are coming from. Let's mouse over a low salience state like South Dakota as a point of comparison. We can see that in South Dakota, across this entire time period from 2013 to 2022, only 1% of tweets by legislators were about immigration. And because there's not a lot of legislators in South Dakota compared to Texas, and they tweet much less often, this is actually only 99 total tweets about immigration out of a total of 9.5 thousand. So for each state you might mouse over, you can again get a sense both of what the proportion is, but also where these numbers are coming from. Moving down to the timeline, which is under this map. This is also interactive. And so the timeline first shows you month by month the proportion of tweets overall from all legislators that are about immigration. And so we can do things like say, I wonder what this large spike is that is occurring in June of 2018, which appears to be the largest spike in the data, or the month for which there was the highest proportion of immigration tweets. And we again can see where these numbers are coming from, and also think about what might have been going on in June of 2018. And this corresponds to the family separation crisis at the border, which received a lot of engagement and discussion from members of Congress. Just to show some more features of this tool here and how interactive it is, imagine we want to see these salience dynamics for only one state. We can click on Texas here and see that the timeline automatically changes to subset the data just to that produced by legislators from Texas. And we can see that that looks quite different than the overall pattern. So first of all, in the most salient months, we can see the total tweets about immigration spike up to 24.5% of total legislator tweets. So almost a quarter of tweets from Texas legislators were about immigration in March of 2021. What was going on in that time period? So that corresponds to a time where Texas's Governor Abbott, declared a state of emergency at the border and announced Operation Lone Star to commit the Texas National Guard to securing the border. And so this is the time in which immigration was most salient in Texas, which is not the same as what we see when we look at the trends in aggregate. The next features of the site I want to show you have to do with tracking not just the salience of these issues, but the sentiment expressed. So I'll go ahead and clear the filter. So now we're back to the full data set, not just focused on Texas. And if you look at the map, you can see that what we can do is we can first look at the degree to which states express pro-immigration positions in aggregate by clicking this pro-immigration filter. Again, darker states here express more pro-immigration positions while lighter states express less. We can do the same for anti-immigration. And then what I think is perhaps most useful is comparing the pro versus anti-immigration sentiment by state. And so again, we have these mouse over features that allow us to see the actual numbers of pro versus anti-immigration tweets in the data and where the numbers behind those colors are coming from. So what kinds of questions might we be able to answer with this data? I think one type of question that we might be interested in understanding could be, how does the policy positions expressed about immigration shift by members of Congress between the Trump and Biden administrations? So if we pull our little timeline tracker over to the start of the Trump administration in January of 2017, we can restrict our data to that time period. The Biden administration begins here in January of 2021. And we start to see this pattern emerge where it appears that there's a great deal more pro-immigration content being produced by members of Congress under Trump, and then a great deal more anti-immigration content being produced under Biden. Now, the one place where that pattern doesn't appear to hold is in this part of the plot right here, where we're still looking at the Trump administration, but anti-immigration content comes to dominate. So what does that time period correspond to? January of 2019 is when the government shutdown occurred over the funding of Trump's border wall. And this is a period in which Trump received a lot of criticism from fellow Republicans around not following through with promises surrounding the border wall. So this is a simple example, but just to say that being able to view these long-term trends allows us to really understand shifting dynamics in the policy positions expressed over time. We can also then scroll down and use the other features of our tool to understand who is expressing these policy positions. So if we restrict our data, say, just to the Biden administration, so I'm just dragging this over to January of 2021, we can see that under the Biden administration, there's a lot more anti-immigration rhetoric than pro-immigration rhetoric. And the vast majority of anti-immigration tweets are coming from the Republican Party. 96% of anti-immigration tweets are from the Republican Party, but Democrats don't have a monopoly on the pro-immigration tweets. Almost a third of pro-immigration tweets are also coming from Republicans. We can also see these splits by House and Senate, which are largely a function of the fact that there are far more members of the House of Representatives than senators just overall, which means far more of the tweets come from the House than the Senate. You can also see when we're looking at this data, this is restricted just to the period of the Biden administration, but we could look at other periods as well, how these dynamics split state by state. So the last thing that I'll show you, I'll go ahead and clear our filters before I turn this over to Q&A, is this key moments feature. So our most recent key moment that we have is the current Ukraine crisis, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So first we can mouse over and see a description of the event. More than 3 million Ukrainians fled the country in the first few weeks following Russia's invasion. We can click on this and it will subset our map and our timeline just to the period surrounding Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And now because this event isn't over yet, we don't have kind of a buffer zone of data on the other side, but as we continue to collect data, the timeline for this event will expand to reflect that. So if we look just at this period, there might have been an expectation that given all of the kind of pro-Ukrainian sentiment being expressed and sympathy for refugees in this period, that we might have seen some kind of uptick in immigration rhetoric in this period. When we look at the data, it doesn't necessarily seem like that's happening. So this week right here is the first week of the invasion. It doesn't seem like relative to the previous period that there's been much of a uptick in discussion of immigration sort of caused by the Ukraine crisis. We can also, again, look at this in terms of the pro versus anti-immigration view and see that, like most of the period of the Biden administration, the data for this period surrounding the Ukraine crisis is largely expressing anti-immigrant attitudes, although it's perhaps worth noting that over the past week, it looks like this is getting to be more 50-50 pro-immigration versus anti-immigration rhetoric. So it will be interesting to continue to track how this debate unfolds around the Ukraine crisis. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing now, but hopefully this was helpful in giving you an overview of how the tool works.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. And with that, we'll turn it over to Julia for some quick reactions. And just as a quick reminder, if you have a question about the tracker or anything else you've heard, please put it in the Q&A so we can resurface that question then for the Q&A. With that, Julia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. That's such an impressive tool that you put together there, Alex. I'm really honored to be a part of this discussion. Just for those of you who don't know why am I here, I have sort of devoted my life as a journalist to building tech tools for accountability. And so I am a huge fan of all such efforts like that, like this one, where we can use technology to provide accountability to the public. For so long, tech being expensive and hard to build, it has mostly been used by institutions and with power to shape narratives. And as journalists and civil society, we also need to use the power of technology to advocate for us as citizens to understand the world around us. And when we are in a world like this, where the flood of information is like overwhelming, it's really hard to sort through. In the old days, when there were basically 3 white men at each news channel who decided what went on the 6 o'clock broadcast at night, that was the decision about what was the important thing in the world. Now, it's actually hard to know what is that decision. And that decision is made in part by these platforms. It's about what they put in your feed. And so I thought it would be interesting to just provide a little reflection, if you guys don't mind bearing with me, about some of the stuff we've done. I've done similarly to this tool. And also, but before I do that, I wanted to sort of reflect a little bit on this tweet tracker. There's a few things that I thought were just really so cool about it. And one is the timeline and just the ability to adjust that. That is something that is going to be really useful to journalists and researchers, but also using machine learning to build a classifier to understand what is an immigration tweet is actually incredibly powerful. This is something that I have really wanted more journalists and researchers to do, is to use machine learning to automate tasks that previously we had to do by hand, right? The way that a journalist would understand what somebody's views were to collect, essentially, usually for journalists, 3 anecdotes, and then put them in a story and be like, those 3 data points sort of suggest that, well, I mean, I don't think it's a real secret. What is Ted Cruz's view on immigration? But let's say you were wondering, you would have a couple anecdotes. Right now, you have a full body of basically every single statement. And one of the things that I think I'm curious about is how much accountability work you could do with this tool, whether you could try to find contradictory statements or even to classify inflammatory statements, right? The specific issue with immigration that is so kind of terrifying is that it is one of the areas where people and politicians use what I think I don't know if all of you are familiar with this term, dangerous speech. But dangerous speech is when politicians use inflammatory rhetoric to dehumanize a group of people and calling them insects. And there's a lot of literature about that. And it often leads to real world violence. That's what happened in Rwanda before the genocides, in Myanmar. There is a lot of evidence that that type of speech is extremely dangerous. And so I would be interested to know if this tool could be used to identify that type of speech and flag it before it spreads too far. And so that is one of the things I'm just really excited about, whether this classifier could be built to do that. And one other thing that is just super cool, which Alex didn't talk about, but I noticed on the website, is a section for null results. This is something that I have been really desperate for, which is basically in a lot of the work that people like the Immigration Policy Lab and like myself who work with big data, oftentimes we test a hypothesis and we get null results, right? One time I did a big analysis when I was at ProPublica of whether sentiment analysis software, which aims to determine based on a tweet whether somebody is for or against something, was gender biased. There was a theory out there that men's views were more strident and that they were therefore getting overweighted in sentiment analysis tools. And so my colleague and I did like a huge analysis of 10 million tweets coded by gender, and we got null results, meaning there was no conclusive difference. But we never published them because that's not a journalistic thing to do, to publish. But I've always felt that there would be use for people in that kind of result. And so I was really thrilled to see that you guys are including that in here, because I think that sometimes it's just that you're testing the wrong hypothesis, or maybe there's something in there that you didn't see but someone else would see. And so there's a real contribution to the research community to start publishing null results. Now, I will just sort of say that my personal history is mostly on tracking Facebook. So Facebook is a very different ecosystem than Twitter. There's no API that you can access. It's really difficult. And it is, but I think it's incredibly important. And so what I have done at the Markup, which is a nonprofit newsroom that I founded a couple years ago, is we actually decided that the only way to really monitor Facebook would be to build a nationwide panel of people who agreed to contribute their data to us. Because as you all know, you probably use Facebook, your feed looks different than everyone else's feed, and you can't, no one else can see it, right? Twitter, the thing is, Ted Cruz tweets out the same thing to all of his audience, but in theory, on Facebook, he could send targeted messages that are different to different groups. And we wanted to see if we could capture what was showing up in people's feeds, and we needed a representative sample. Now, one thing that we did was our hypothesis was slightly different. We are testing what was Facebook promoting in people's feeds. What were they pushing higher? It looks like that this tracker is testing politicians' statements themselves, not the platform's behavior. And these are slightly different. But it is something that I think is very important, is to see what are these platforms choosing to promote. So we built this panel more than a year and a half ago, and we've been tracking a Facebook panel of about 1,000 people for this whole time. And we have found repeatedly that Facebook says it's going to cut out certain things like anti-vax content or pushing political groups. And then when we look, they continue to do what they say they're not going to do. And so it's been an incredible accountability tool to show that this platform, Facebook, repeatedly says it's going to change its algorithm and then doesn't. And the reason is because no one can see what their algorithm is doing. And so I'm just delighted to be part of this announcement. It's like a fellow tool in an arsenal that we all need as citizens. And I will stop talking and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Julia, for these insightful comments. So we have a couple of questions that are coming in. So thanks to all of you who've submitted questions. And maybe we'll start with the first one, which is for Alex. And so there's a couple of questions that maybe we can answer all as one, which are about sort of, whether you can tell us a little bit more about how the classifier kind of works, especially, how you avoid kind of overfitting for these tweets, and also what happens in terms of the updating kind of over time as the immigration debate might change in terms of the dictionaries, et cetera. Alex, so maybe you can talk about that.
Sure. So this is a great question. And there are so many kind of different classifiers and machine learning approaches at our disposal for classifying policy positions on immigration or other issues of interest. And we wound up trying out a number of different classifiers, which you can kind of see the performance of in our working paper if you're interested in the details of that. But we wound up just going with a simple naive Bayes classifier for this tool for classifying pro-immigration and anti-immigration policy positions. And this is because it appeared to perform with pretty high levels of precision, accuracy, and recall. And kind of more importantly, we got high levels of balanced accuracy, which take into account that some of these tweet types might be rarer than others. And because it's a very interpretable model, that's what we went with for the purpose of building the tool. I think there's lots of other approaches that one could try, but because what the tool is really tracking is these broad patterns, we don't have much of a reason to believe that our classifier has different performance in different time periods that we're looking at. And we've done some manual validation, which suggests that as well. In terms of updating the classifier, this is actually an issue that we're still working through. So from the 2013 to 2020 data that was used to train the classifier, this covers a really large stretch of time. So there's lots of different types of tweets showing up and lots of different facets of the immigration debate across that time period. And from the validation that we continue to do, it appears that our performance is still looking pretty good for the newer tweets, but it's going to be important, depending on how long we keep the tool around for, that we get new human coded data and continue to update the classifier to make sure it's properly capturing the immigration debate as it continues to evolve. And I think the biggest risk we run is if there are particular tweets, say, about immigration that are using hyper-specific words that were not part of the debate a year ago or so, that's where we're going to have the most trouble kind of accurately categorizing tweets according to whether or not they discuss immigration and then identifying the policy positions that are expressed.
Thanks a lot, Alex. So another question, this one's for Ziv. Given the work that you do at your center, like what do you see as the broad challenges and opportunities for real-time tracking of speech on social media platforms?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and I'm going to sort of I'll highlight briefly 3 challenges and then 2 opportunities. So the first challenge is that sort of this speech takes place within the conditions of the platform. So this is not only the affordances that the platforms offer, but also the audiences that are on the platform. So there's this great new working paper by Cody Buntain, a computer scientist, that looks at sort of congressional use of Twitter versus Facebook, which is something that Julia mentioned earlier. These are 2 very different platforms, and the sources that Congress people share on either of those platforms, and thus the sort of ideological position that they might take on those platforms. And the sort of like high level finding is that they're different. And so when we try to track sort of speech in real time on platforms, understanding that it's not just sort of speech per se, but speech influenced by the platforms. The second is just sort of representativeness. That's less of an issue when we look at sort of elite speech. Every member of Congress is on Twitter, but especially when we look to see public opinion. I mean, I think the latest Pew results were only 22% of American adults are on Twitter, and most of those people are just sort of lurkers who are watching other people tweet and not tweeting themselves. So thinking about issues of sort of the representativeness of the sample that is on platforms. And then finally, this is something that Julia mentioned, but I just really want to stress, which is sort of data size and complexity, right? So one of the typical ways that a journalist would study these topics, right? Julia mentioned is to find 3 sort of anecdotes. With social media data, they're huge and they're optimized for search, and so you can end up sort of finding the thing that you're looking for very easily, but it's very hard to contextualize it. And so that's again why we're really excited to sort of work on this project with Alex and hopefully other projects like this in the future. And then 2 sort of quick opportunities. The first is in a world that sort of shifts as rapidly as it does, being able to use social media enables us to essentially study things in real time that we wouldn't be able to do in surveys, right? And so like, with, let's say the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we're able to retrospectively understand speech around that without, let's say, days or weeks later putting a survey out into the field. And so we get this sort of real-time aspect that I think often is missing from other sort of approaches to collecting data. And the second is while sort of I mentioned that a challenge was that speech was influenced by platforms, it also is speech, right? It's not someone responding to a survey question, and the sort of challenges that sort of we all know are present there, and so there's you can sort of have this fly on the wallness as a journalist or a researcher that I think is really beneficial.
Great, thank you so much, Ziv. And then another question. This one's for Julia. How do you think journalism will be affected by tools tracking political speech on social media? And also for those of us building those tools, like what kind of guidance do you have to make sure that these tools themselves do not become sort of AI black boxes to the general public?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think for journalists, tools like this are so important because most journalists don't work in a newsroom like mine, where we have programmers and we're building tools, and I've devoted the markup to this idea that like we should try to build these large data sets and really provide that context. But that's a very privileged position. Most journalists have to write multiple stories a day. They're in a rush, they're underpaid, overworked. And so anything that provides that context, so it's like, okay, I'm writing about X tweet, but I can put it in the context of like, there's generally what it seems like the data showed, for instance, is that whatever the opposition party is louder, right? That seems like during the Trump administration, the pro-immigration was louder, and now we're in the Biden administration, the anti-immigration. And so like, that's just a really helpful piece of context to put into a story where you're like, okay, I'm writing about this, but it's in the context that party is always going to yell more because they're not in power. And so that is a very helpful thing. And that's something that I always talk about, is that one of the goals I have as a journalist with the markup and the work that I've done on bringing big data is literally just to increase the sample size. Like journalism has previously been like, I interviewed 3 people in a diner and that is my sample size for like political sentiment. And that's just because of the human scale. Like there's only so many people you can talk to in a day, right? But like if we can increase the sample size to 10 people in a diner, that's better. And if it's 10,000 people tweeting, that's even better, right? And so I think in general, the more that these kinds of tools can help the public understand and put in context the sort of inflammatory, sensational things that they're being fed all the time through social media, I think that's extremely helpful in sort of restoring some understanding of reality, because we don't have a sense of shared reality right now. People who see those pro-immigration tweets are probably not seeing the anti, and vice versa. And so putting a context out there, which is like, you're not what you're seeing isn't actually representative, is extremely helpful.
Great, thank you so much. Another question for Alex, which is like, when did you start collecting data weekly, and how do you deal with deleted tweets? And then there's also another question about, how could this be used for other topics, or maybe for other contexts, like, say another country, for example.
Great, thank you. Yeah, these are both great questions. So we started collecting the weekly data in 2020, and it is true in general with Twitter data collections, there is this concern that if you're collecting historical data initially, you'll be missing these deleted tweets. Because CSMAP actually has had a collection devoted to members of Congress's tweets this whole time, even though we didn't initially use their data for our historical collection, I actually was able to go through and compare that initial data set to the one that was collected with the streaming API in real time. And the patterns we observe look extremely similar. Members of Congress actually don't delete their tweets that often, and their accounts are not suspended that often relative to if we were looking at mass level Twitter data. I think this would be much more of a concern if we were doing something like trying to track extremist rhetoric by average Twitter users, where we would expect that some large and non-random portion of the tweets might be deleted ultimately. And in terms of kind of applying this approach to other topics, I think this is absolutely doable. Actually, in the working paper, if you take a look at it, we use a similar approach to track the climate change debate, which instead of looking at pro versus anti-immigration tweets, we're basically looking at pro versus anti-regulation to prevent climate change types of tweets. I think with the design of this site in particular, there's a lot of trade-offs between kind of complexity and making the site user-friendly. So we wound up deciding that having kind of just 2 sides to the issue made it easiest to display our data. Now, some issues can be more neatly broken apart into these kinds of pro versus anti categories than others. So in thinking about issues that would make good candidates for real-time tracking, just the complexity of the issue, I think is something that definitely comes into play. And we had originally planned to kind of build the site tracking the immigration debate in multiple countries. IPL does lots of work in different global contexts, and we were hoping to do that. We, it's a very labor-intensive task thinking about how to train these classifiers in all these different languages and making sure you have, coders and people to check the validation who have enough language skills and cultural context to do it well. So it's definitely doable, and is just something that we haven't done yet. But I think this could be the kind of sky is the limit in terms of creating more of these tools. And we hope to see more come into existence, because I think they really make some of the academic work that we do more accessible to a broad audience.
Great. That's a nice segue to the next question, which is more for Ziv. Given the work that you've done, you think it's possible to build a similar tool to track or study online abuse or harassment?
So I think the answer here is sort of yes and no. Yes, it is possible. There are also some great sort of current out-of-the-box classification systems that can be used, such as Jigsaw's Perspective API tool that allows for relatively sort of, at least on the researcher or journalist side, lightweight sort of classification lifts. Megan Brown and I have used it a number of times to try to understand the impact of like elite discourse on mass discourse on Twitter as it relates to sort of harmful speech. You run into a couple different challenges. Alex can actually speak to this really well because of some of work she's done in the past on hate speech classification. But that said, it's an extraordinarily difficult task, especially given that the sort of hate speech words that people use tend to be dynamic over time. And the second is you run into the other issue that Alex mentioned, which is that people delete their tweets. And as these platforms get better at sort of identifying hateful messaging, that like if you were to track changes over time, it would be uncertain whether you're actually sort of what you're measuring are the changes in people's speech or the platforms getting better at being able to sort of take down that speech. And so I think in general, it can be done, but there are challenges that would be that would impact the ability to do so that are not present in the sort of congressional tweet tracker.
Great, thank you. Then we have a question for Julia, which is tech companies have generally taken a very conservative approach to sharing data. Are there any examples of transparency and collaboration between tech and researchers or journalists that can serve as models for the future?
I appreciate the euphemism of conservative. Facebook has gone after researchers and threatened legal action against researchers. That's probably a more accurate way to describe the relationship with Facebook and research. And that happened, you know, obviously with Zeke's colleagues at NYU, and we have seen it in international with some people in the EU. That happened to a tool that I built at ProPublica called the Facebook Political Ad Collector. We got threatening letters from Facebook about that. And so it's a difficult situation because the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is a law that basically says that if you break the terms of service of a website, you could face criminal liability. It was passed after the War Games movie, and people were really freaked out about hackers in the 80s, and it's really been abused to mean that people who scrape a website, if the website says in the terms of service, like you can't take the information on this website, even though it's freely available to the public, but you can't collect it using automated means, you could be facing some sort of liability. And so that is a legal risk that faces all researchers in this area, except I think when you're using the API like you are here in Twitter, that's a different story. That's an authorized use. But with a lot of platforms, there isn't an API like Facebook and Google. And so that is a challenge that is really, I think, preventing growth in this field. And there are proposals out there to make an exemption for researchers and journalists to that law. And there's been proposals asking Facebook just to please just agree to an exemption without a law. And so far, there hasn't been any progress there. But I think as we move more and more into a world where we spend all of our life on these little boxes talking to each other and our whole life is mediated by this technology, I think it becomes increasingly important that we find a way to bridge that divide. And I guess the question was, are there any good examples of transparency and collaboration? Definitely Twitter has been the most friendly to researchers amongst them, but I wouldn't say that it's been perfect.
Thank you very much. One question for Alex, which is about is every tweet classified as either pro or anti-immigration, or also are there also tweets that are kind of centrist or sort of like in the middle?
This is a great question. So in our data, there were actually quite a lot of tweets that we classified more as neutral than centrist. And these tend to include tweets like members of Congress will frequently say things like, please come to my town hall where we'll be discussing immigration, climate change, and the war in Ukraine or something, right? Where they're just sort of letting constituents know what issues they're focusing on, but aren't actually expressing a position. And so for those types of tweets, that would contribute to our salience score in terms of how much are they talking about immigration, but doesn't factor into our classification, because ultimately we train two classifiers, one that's basically, does the tweet express an anti-immigration position or not, and one that's, does the tweet express a pro-immigration position or not. We actually initially toyed with including those neutral tweets in the visualization on the online tool, and people who we user tested it with found it kind of distracting and confusing. So I think this is also something just to bear in mind for researchers looking to build future tools, that sometimes all of the dynamics you'd like to see in like a research paper or a working paper may not be the best fit for these types of interactive tools, although we'd love more feedback on how to do that moving forward.
Great, thank you so much. I see there are more questions, but unfortunately we have arrived at the end of the hour. So Alex, Julia, and Steve, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today and present about this fascinating tool. And for everybody else, please feel free to go to the website and explore the tool for yourself, send some comments or feedback. We're always interested in that. And with that, I wish everybody a great rest of the day. And thank you very much for joining again. Bye, folks.